You surely don't think of mounting a mast like that upon a carriage?" asked the Major. "It would be a superb idea, though," said Maston. "But impracticable," replied Barbicane. "No, I think of sinking this engine in the earth alone, binding it with hoops of wrought iron, and finally surrounding it with a thick mass of masonry of stone and cement. The piece once cast, it must be bored with great precision, so as to preclude any possible windage, so there will be no loss whatever of gas. And all the expansive force of the powder will be employed in the propulsion." "One simple question," said Elphinstone, "is our gun to be rifle?" "No, certainly not," replied Barbicane. "We require an enormous initial velocity, and you are well aware that a shot quits a rifled gun less rapidly than it does a smooth bore." "True," rejoined the Major. The committee here adjourned for a few minutes to tea and sandwiches. "On the discussion being renewed, gentlemen," said Barbicane, "we must now take into consideration the metal to be employed. Our cannon must be possessed of great tenacity, great hardness, be infusible by heat, indissoluble and inoxidable by the corrosive action of acids." "There is no doubt about that," replied the Major. "And as we shall have to employ an immense quantity of metal, we shall not be at a loss for choice." "Well, then," said Morgan, "I propose the best alloy hitherto known, which consists of 100 parts of copper, 12 of tin, and 6 of brass." "I admit," replied the President, "that this composition has yielded excellent results, but in the present case it would be too expensive and very difficult to work. I think, then, that we ought to adopt a material excellent in its way and of low price, such as cast iron. What is your advice, Major?" "I quite agree with you," replied Elphinstone. "In fact," continued Barbicane, "cast iron costs 10 times less than bronze. It is easy to cast, it runs readily from the molds of sand, it is easy of manipulation, it is at once economical of money and of time. In addition, it is excellent as a material, and I well remember that during the war, at the siege of Atlanta, some iron guns fired 1,000 rounds at intervals of 20 minutes without injury." "Cast iron is very brittle, though," replied Morgan. "Yes, but it possesses great resistance. I will now ask our worthy secretary to calculate the weight of a cast iron gun with a bore of 9 feet and a thickness of 6 feet of metal." "In a moment," replied Maston. Then, dashing off some algebraical formula with marvelous facility in a minute or two, he declared the following result: "The cannon will weigh 68,040 tons, and at 2 cents a pound, it will cost $2,510,701. Maston, the Major, and the General regarded Barbicane with uneasy looks. "Well, gentlemen," replied the President, "I repeat what I said yesterday. Make yourselves easy. The millions will not be wanting." With this assurance of their President, the committee separated, after having fixed their third meeting for the following evening. Chapter 9. The question of the powders. There remained for consideration merely the question of powders. The public awaited with interest its final decision, the size of the projectile, the length of the cannon being settled, what would be the quantity of powder necessary to produce impulsion. It is generally asserted that gunpowder was invented in the 14th century by the monk, Schwartz, who paid for his grand discovery with his life. It is, however, pretty well proved that this story ought to be ranked among the legends of the Middle Ages. Gunpowder was not invented by anyone. It was the lineal successor of the Greek fire, which, like itself, was composed of sulfur and saltpeter. Few persons are acquainted with the mechanical power of gunpowder. Now this is precisely what is necessary to be understood in order to comprehend the importance of the question submitted to the committee. A liter of gunpowder weighs about 2 pounds. During combustion it produces 400 liters of gas. This gas, on being liberated and acted upon by temperature raised to 2,400 degrees, occupies a space of 4,000 liters. Consequently, the volume of powder is to the volume of gas produced by its combustion, as 1 to 4,000 one may judge. Therefore, of the tremendous pressure on this gas, when compressed within a space 4,000 times to confine, all this was, of course, well known to the members of the committee when they met on the following evening. The first speaker on this occasion was Major Elphinstone, who had been the director of the gunpowder factories during the war. "Gentlemen," said this distinguished chemist, "I begin with some figures, which will serve as the basis of our calculation. The old 24-pounder shot required for its discharge 16 pounds of powder." "You are certain of this amount?" broke in Barbicane. "Quite certain," replied the major. "The Armstrong cannon employs only 75 pounds of powder for a projectile of 800 pounds, and the Rodman Columbiad uses only 160 pounds of powder to send its half-ton shot a distance of 6 miles. These facts cannot be called in question, for I myself raised the point during the depositions taken before the Committee of Artillery." "Quite true," said the general. "Well," replied the major, "these figures go to prove that the quantity of powder is not increased with the weight of the shot. That is to say, if a 24-pounder shot requires 16 pounds of powder. In other words, if in ordinary guns, we employ a quantity of powder equal to 2/3 of the weight of the projectile, this proportion is not constant. Calculate, and you will see that, in place of 333 pounds of powder, the quantity is reduced to no more than 160 pounds. "What are you aiming at?" asked the president. "If you push your theory to extremes, my dear Major," said J.T. Maston, "you will get to this, that as soon as your shot becomes sufficiently heavy, you will not require any powder at all." "Our friend Maston is always at his jokes, even in serious matters," cried the major. "But let him make his mind easy. I am going presently to propose gunpowder enough to satisfy his artillerists' propensities. I only keep to statistical facts when I say that during the war, and for the very largest guns, the weight of the powder was reduced, as the result of experience, to 1/10 part of the weight of the shot." "Perfectly correct," said Morgan. "But before deciding the quantity of powder necessary to give the impulse, I think it would be as well. We shall have to employ a large-grained powder," continued the major. "Its combustion is more rapid than that of the small." "No doubt about that," replied Morgan. "But it is very destructive, and ends by enlarging the bore of the pieces." "Granted, but that which is injurious to a gun, destined to perform long service, is not so to our Columbiad. We shall run no danger of an explosion. And it is necessary that our powder should take fire instantaneously in order that its mechanical effect may be complete. We must have," said Maston, "several touch holes, so as to fire it at different points at the same time." "Certainly," replied Elphinstone, but that will render the working of the piece more difficult. I return then to my large-grained powder, which removes those difficulties. In his Columbia charges Rodman employed a powder as large as chestnuts, made of willow charcoal, simply dried in cast iron pans. This powder was hard and glittering, left no trace upon the hand, contained hydrogen and oxygen in large proportion, took fire instantaneously and, though very destructive, did not sensibly injure the mouthpiece. Up to this point Barbicane had kept aloof from the discussion. He left the others to speak while he himself listened. He had evidently got an idea. He now simply said, "Well, my friends, what quantity of powder do you propose?" The three members looked at one another. 200,000 pounds, at last said Morgan. 500,000, added the Major. 800,000, screamed Maston. A moment of silence followed this triple proposal. It was at last broken by the President. "Gentlemen," he quietly said, "I start from this principle, that the resistance of a gun, constructed under the given conditions, is unlimited. I shall surprise our friend, Maston, then, by stigmatizing his calculations as timid, and I propose to double his 800,000 pounds of powder." 1,600,000 pounds, shouted Maston, leaping from his seat. "Just so. We shall have to come then to my ideal of a cannon half a mile long. For you see 1,600,000 pounds will occupy a space of about 20,000 cubic feet. And since the contents of your cannon do not exceed 54,000 cubic feet, it would be half full, and the bore will not be more than long enough for the gas to communicate to the projectile sufficient impulse." "Nevertheless," said the President, "I hold to that quantity of powder. Now, 1,600,000 pounds of powder will create 6 billion liters of gas, 6,000 millions. You quite understand." "What is to be done then?" said the General. "The thing is very simple. We must reduce this enormous quantity of powder, while preserving to it its mechanical power." "Good, but by what means?" "I am going to tell you," replied Barbicane quietly. "Nothing is more easy than to reduce this mass to 1/4 of its bulk. You know that curious cellular matter, which constitutes the elementary tissues of vegetable? This substance is found quite pure in many bodies, especially in cotton, which is nothing more than the down of the seeds of the cotton plant. Now cotton, combined with cold nitric acid, become transformed into a substance eminently insoluble, combustible, and explosive. It was first discovered in 1832 by Braconnot, a French chemist, who called it xyloidine. In 1838 another Frenchman, Palouse, investigated its different properties, and finally, in 1846, Schonbein, professor of chemistry at Bâle, proposed its employment for purposes of war. This powder, now called pyroxyle, or fulminating cotton, is prepared with great facility by simply plunging cotton for 15 minutes in nitric acid, then washing it in water, then drying it, and it is ready for use. "Nothing could be more simple," said Morgan. "Moreover, pyroxyle is unaltered by moisture, a valuable property to us, inasmuch as it would take several days to charge the cannon. It ignites at 170 degrees, in place of 240, and its combustion is so rapid that one may set light to it on the top of the ordinary powder, without the latter having time to ignite." "Perfect," exclaimed the Major. "Only it is more expensive." "What matter?" cried J.T. Maston. Finally, it imparts to projectiles a velocity 4 times superior to that of gunpowder. I will even add that if we mix it with 1/8 of its own weight of nitrate of potassium, its expansive force is again considerably augmented. Will that be necessary? Asked the Major. I think not, replied Barbicane. So, then, in place of 1,600,000 pounds of powder, we shall have but 400,000 pounds of fulminating cotton. And since we can, without danger, compress 500 pounds of cotton into 27 cubic feet, the whole quantity will not occupy a height of more than 180 feet within the bore of the Columbiad. In this way the shot will have more than 700 feet of bore to traverse under a force of 6,000,000 liters of gas before taking its flight toward the moon. At this juncture J.T. Maston could not repress his emotion. He flung himself into the arms of his friend with the violence of a projectile, and Barbicane would have been stove in if he had not been boom-proof. This incident terminated the third meeting of the committee. Barbicane and his bold colleagues, to whom nothing seemed impossible, had succeeded in solving the complex problems of projectile, cannon, and powder. Their plan was drawn up, and it only remained to put it into execution. A mere matter of detail, a bagatelle, said J.T. Maston. Chapter 10. ONE enemy V20 FIV millions OF friends. The American public took a lively interest in the smallest details of the enterprise of the Gun Club. It followed day by day the discussion of the committee, the most simple preparations for the great experiment, the questions of figures which it involved, the mechanical difficulties to be resolved in one word. The entire plan of work roused the popular excitement to the highest pitch. The purely scientific attraction was suddenly intensified by the following incident. We have seen what legions of admirers and friends Barbicane's project had rallied round its author. There was, however, one single individual alone in all the states of the Union who protested against the attempt of the Gun Club. He attacked it furiously on every opportunity. And human nature is such that Barbicane felt more keenly the opposition of that one man than he did the applause of all the others. He was well aware of the motive of this antipathy, the origin of this solitary enmity, the cause of its personality and old standing, and in what rivalry of self-love it had its rise. This persevering enemy the president of the Gun Club had never seen. Fortunate that it was so, for a meeting between the two men would certainly have been attended with serious consequences. This rival was a man of science, like Barbicane himself, of a fiery, daring, and violent disposition. A pure Yankee, his name was Captain Nicholl. He lived at Philadelphia. Most people are aware of the curious struggle which arose during the Federal War between the guns and armor of iron-plated ships. The result was the entire reconstruction of the navy of both the continents. As the one grew heavier, the other became thicker in proportion. The Merrimac, the Monitor, the Tennessee, the Weehawken discharged enormous projectiles themselves, after having been armor-clad against the projectiles of others. In fact, they did to others that which they would not they should do to them. That grand principle of immortality upon which rests the whole art of war. Now, if Barbicane was a great founder of shot, Nicholl was a great forger of plates. The one cast night and day at Baltimore, the other forged day and night at Philadelphia. As soon as ever Barbicane invented a new shot, Nicholl invented a new plate. Each followed a current of ideas, essentially opposed to the other, Happily for these citizens, so useful to their country, a distance of from 50 to 60 miles separated them from one another, and they had never yet met. Which of these two inventors had the advantage over the other? It was difficult to decide from the results obtained. By last accounts, however, it would seem that the armor plate would in the end have to give way to the shot. Nevertheless, there were competent judges who had their doubts on the point. At the last experiment, the cylindro-conical projectiles of Barbicane stuck like so many pins in the nickel plates. On that day the Philadelphia iron forger then believed himself victorious, and could not evince contempt enough for his rival. But when the other afterward substituted for conical shot simple 600-pound shells at very moderate velocity, the captain was obliged to give in. In fact, these projectiles knocked his best metal plate to shivers. Matters were at this stage, and victory seemed to rest with the shot, when the war came to an end on the very day when nickel had completed a new armor plate of wrought steel. It was a masterpiece of its kind, and bid defiance to all the projectiles of the world. The captain had it conveyed to the Polygon at Washington, challenging the president of the gun club to break it. Barbicane, peace having been declared, declined to try the experiment. Nickel, now furious, offered to expose his plate to the shock of any shot, solid, hollow, round, or conical, refused by the president, who did not choose to compromise his last success. Nickel, disgusted by this obstinacy, tried to tempt Barbicane by offering him every chance. He proposed to fix the plate within 200 yards of the gun, Barbicane still obstinate in refusal. 100 yards. Not even 75. At 50 then, roared the captain through the newspapers. At 25 yards. And I'll stand behind. Barbicane returned for answer that, even if Captain Nickel would be so good as to stand in front, he would not fire any more. Nickel could not contain himself at this reply, threw out hints of cowardice. That a man who refused to fire a cannon shot was pretty near being afraid of it. That artillerists, who fight at 6 miles distance, are substituting mathematical formulae for individual courage. To these insinuations Barbicane returned no answer. Perhaps he never heard of them, so absorbed was he in the calculations for his great enterprise. When his famous communication was made to the gun club, the captain's wrath passed all bounds. With his intense jealousy was mingled a feeling of absolute impotence. How was he to invent anything to beat this 900 feet Columbiad? What armor plate could ever resist a projectile of 30,000 pounds weight? Overwhelmed at first under this violent shock, he by and by recovered himself, and resolved to crush the proposal by weight of his arguments. He then violently attacked the labors of the gun club, published a number of letters in the newspapers, endeavored to prove Barbicane ignorant of the first principles of gunnery. He maintained that it was absolutely impossible to impress upon any body whatever a velocity of 12,000 yards per second, that even with such a velocity a projectile of such a weight could not transcend the limits of the Earth's atmosphere. Further still, even regarding the velocity to be acquired, and granting it to be sufficient, the shell could not resist the pressure of the gas developed by the ignition of 1,600,000 pounds of powder. And supposing it to resist that pressure, it would be less able to support that temperature. It would melt on quitting the Columbiad, and fall back in a red-hot shower upon the heads of the imprudent spectators. Barbicane continued his work, without regarding these attacks. Nickel then took up the question in its other aspects, without touching upon its uselessness in all points of view. He regarded the experiment as fraught with extreme danger, both to the citizens, who might sanction by their presence so reprehensible a spectacle, and also to the towns in the neighborhood of this deplorable cannon. He also observed that, if the projectile did not succeed in reaching its destination, a result absolutely impossible, it must inevitably fall back upon the earth, and that the shock of such a mass, multiplied by the square of its velocity, would seriously endanger every point of the globe. Under the circumstances, therefore, and without interfering with the rights of free citizens, it was a case for the intervention of government, which ought not to endanger the safety of all for the pleasure of one individual. In spite of all his arguments, however, Captain Nickel remained alone in his opinion. Nobody listened to him, and he did not succeed in alienating a single admirer from the president of the gun club. The latter did not even take the pains to refute the arguments of his rival. Nickel, driven into his last entrenchments, and not able to fight personally in the cause, resolved to fight with money. He published, therefore, in the Richmond Enquirer a series of wagers, conceived in these terms, and on an increasing scale. Number 1,000. The necessary funds for the experiment of the gun club will not be forthcoming. Number 2,000. The operation of casting a cannon of 900 feet is impracticable, and cannot possibly succeed. Number 3,000. Is it impossible to load the Columbiad, and that the pyroxyle will take fire spontaneously under the pressure of the projectile? Number 4,000. The Columbiad will burst at the first fire. Number 5,000. The shot will not travel farther than 6 miles, and that it will fall back again a few seconds after its discharge. It was an important sum, therefore, which the captain risked in his invincible obstinacy. He had no less than $15,000 at stake. Notwithstanding the importance of the challenge, on the 19th of May, he received a sealed packet containing the following superbly laconic reply: Baltimore, October 19th. Done. Barbicane. Chapter 11. Florida and Texas. One question remained yet to be decided. It was necessary to choose a favorable spot for the experiment. According to the advice of the Observatory of Cambridge, the gun must be fired perpendicularly to the plane of the horizon, that is to say, toward the zenith. Now the moon does not traverse the zenith, except in places situated between 0 and 28 of latitude. It became, then, necessary to determine exactly that spot on the globe where the immense Columbiad should be cast. On the 20th of October, at a general meeting of the Gun Club, Barbicane produced a magnificent map of the United States. Gentlemen, said he, in opening the discussion, I presume that we are all agreed that this experiment cannot, and ought not to be tried anywhere, but within the limits of the soil of the Union. Now, by good fortune, certain frontiers of the United States extend downward, as far as the 28th parallel of the north latitude. If you will cast your eye over this map, you will see that we have at our disposal the whole of the southern portion of Texas and Florida. It was finally agreed, then, that the Columbiad must be cast on the soil of either Texas or Florida. The result, however, of this decision was to create a rivalry entirely without precedent between the different towns of these two states. The 28th parallel, on reaching the American coast, traverses the peninsula of Florida, dividing it into two nearly equal portions, then, plunging into the Gulf of Mexico, it subtends the arc formed by the coast of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Then skirting Texas, off which it cuts an angle, it continues its course over Mexico, crosses the Sonora Old California, and loses itself in the Pacific Ocean. It was, therefore, only those portions of Texas and Florida, which were situated below this parallel, which came within the prescribed conditions of latitude. Florida, in its southern part, reckons no cities of importance. It is simply studded with forts raised against the roving Indians. One solitary town, Tampa town, was able to put in a claim in favor of its situation. In Texas, on the contrary, the towns are much more numerous and important. Corpus Christi, in the county of Nueces, and all the cities situated on the Rio Bravo, Laredo, Comalites, San Ignacio on the Web, Rio Grande City on the Star, Edinburgh in the Hidalgo, Santa Rita El Panda, Brownsville in the Caman, formed an imposing league against the pretensions of Florida. So, scarcely was the decision known, when the Texan and Floridan deputies arrived at Baltimore in an incredibly short space of time. From that very moment President Barbicane and the influential members of the Gun Club were besieged day and night by formidable claims. If 7 cities of Greece contended for the honor of having given birth to a Homer, here were 2 entire states, threatening to come to blows about the question of a cannon. The rival parties promenaded the streets with arms in their hands, and at every occasion of their meeting a collision was to be apprehended, which might have been attended with disastrous results. Happily the prudence and address of President Barbicane averted the danger. These personal demonstrations found a division in the newspapers of the different states. The New York Herald and the Tribune supported Texas, while the Times and the American Review espoused the cause of the Floridan deputies. The members of the Gun Club could not decide to which to give the preference. Texas produced its array of 26 counties. Florida replied that 12 counties were better than 26 in a country only 1/6 part of the size. Texas plumed itself upon its 330,000 natives. Florida, with a far smaller territory, boasted of being much more densely populated, with 56,000. The Texans, through the columns of the Herald, claimed that some regard should be had to a state which grew the best cotton in all America, produced the best green oak for the service of the Navy, and contained the finest oil, besides iron mines, in which the yield was 50% of pure metal. To this the American Review replied that the soil of Florida, although not equally rich, afforded the best conditions for the molding and casting of the columbiad, consisting as it did of sand and argillaceous earth. "That may be all very well," replied the Texans, "but you must first get to this country. Now the communications with Florida are difficult, while the coast of Texas offers the Bay of Galveston, which possesses a circumference of 14 leagues, and is capable of containing the navies of the entire world." "A pretty notion truly," replied the papers in the interest of Florida, "that of Galveston Bay below the 29th parallel. Have we not got the Bay of Espiritu Santo opening precisely upon the 28th degree, and by which ships can reach Tampa town by direct route? A fine bay, half choked with sand." "Choked yourselves," returned the others. Thus the war went on for several days, when Florida endeavored to draw her adversary away onto fresh ground. And one morning, the Times hinted that, the enterprise being essentially American, it ought not to be attempted upon other than purely American territory. To these words Texas retorted, "American? Are we not as much so as you? Were not Texas and Florida both incorporated into the Union in 1845? Undoubtedly, replied the Times, but we have belonged to the Americans ever since 1820. Yes, returned the Tribune, after having been Spaniards or English for 200 years, you were sold to the United States for $5 million. Well, and why need we blush for that? Was not Louisiana bought from Napoleon in 1803, at the price of $16 million? Scandalous, roared the Texas deputies, a wretched little strip of country like Florida to dare to compare itself to Texas, who, in place of selling herself, asserted her own independence, drove out the Mexicans in March 2, 1846, and declared herself a federal republic after the victory gained by Samuel Houston on the banks of the San Jacinto over the troops of Santa Anna. A country, in fine, which voluntarily annexed itself to the United States of America. Yes, because it was afraid of the Mexicans, replied Florida. Afraid? From this moment the state of things became intolerable. A sanguinary encounter seemed daily imminent between the two parties in the streets of Baltimore. It became necessary to keep an eye upon the deputies. President Barbicane knew not which way to look. Notes, documents, letters full of menaces showered down upon his house. Which side ought he to take? As regarded the appropriation of the soil, the facility of communication, the rapidity of transport, the claims of both states were evenly balanced. As for political prepossessions, they had nothing to do with the question. This deadlock had existed for some little time. When Barbicane resolved to get rid of it all at once, he called a meeting of his colleagues, and laid before them a proposition which, it will be seen, was profoundly sagacious. On carefully considering, he said, what is going on now between Florida and Texas, it is clear that the same difficulties will recur with all the towns of the favored state. The rivalry will descend from state to city, and so on downward. Now Texas possesses 11 towns within the prescribed conditions, which will further dispute the honor and create us new enemies, while Florida has only one. I go in, therefore, for Florida and Tampa town. This decision, on being made known, utterly crushed the Texan deputies. Seized with an indescribable fury, they addressed threatening letters to the different members of the gun club by name. The magistrates had but one course to take, and they took it. They chartered a special train, forced the Texans into it whether they would or no, and they quitted the city with a speed of 30 miles an hour. Quickly, however, as they were dispatched, they found time to hurl one last and bitter sarcasm at their adversaries. Alluding to the extent of Florida, a mere peninsula confined between two seas, they pretended that it could never sustain the shock of the discharge, and that it would bust up at the very first shot. Very well, let it bust up, replied the Floridans, with the brevity of the days of ancient Sparta.